Welcome to this live stream. I'm delighted this afternoon to be back with Dr. Justin Barrett. How are you doing, Justin?
I'm doing well. How about you?
I'm very well myself. I was actually really enjoying putting together the questions for this interview because there's actually a lot of things which I wanted to ask you because your book has done really well. I'm sure you're aware your book has been referenced by theists, atheists, and all over the world. It's sort of a cultural icon when it comes to the discussion about religion and intuitive faith. So to begin off with, did you realize when writing this book that it's going to have the impact that it did?
I might have hoped, but maybe I'm a forever pessimist when it comes to these things. But my assumption was, maybe a few people will read it. Mostly, I think when I write a book, I do it because it feels like something I just ought to do. There's something in there that's sort of gnawing at me, and it's worth saying. So write it down. But no, and I'll tell you, it was a lot of fun to write it too. It was.
Okay, brilliant. One of the clearest things that you argue in the book is that children have a natural tendency to see purpose and design in the world, right? So for someone who hasn't read your book or is not aware of your work, how would you separate that bias that children have towards teleology from genuine religious beliefs that children hold?
Yeah, good. I guess hard to pick exactly the right metaphor. I mean, one way to look at it is this is a piece of the puzzle, and we need to put the jigsaw puzzle together. It's one of the pieces that seems to be supplied, it being this teleological or functional kind of reasoning in early childhood. And you can imagine that idea of there being, I see design and purpose in the world, and now I need to account for why it exists. Well, I might resort to some kind of explanation like, well, people did it. People account for the design and purpose. Well, then we wouldn't normally call that a religious belief. We might call it a sort of a silly one when it comes to things like, I don't know, mountains and rivers and oceans and moons and stars. You might think, well, it's silly to think humans did that. Or something like humans, like space aliens or something like that. But you could imagine somebody thinking that, and then it's not clear we're in a religious realm. And even if we're in something that's closer to a religious realm, somebody could attribute that design and purpose to, I don't know, some kind of nature spirits or something that give rise to the apparent structure and so forth. And then we're talking about something else, right? Or Gaia beliefs, Mother Earth just sort of manifests certain kind of design and purpose. Right. And so I regard that strong tendency that we apparently all have from early childhood to see design and purpose in the natural world around us as one of the pieces, one of the ingredients or building blocks, but not the whole story. It's a good place to start the story, though, because it is this kind of, oh, all right, we're already naturally predisposed to have that wonder about why are things the way they are? Why do things happen the way they do? Where did they come from in the first place, and why?
Absolutely. One of the things that you indicate in the book is that the belief in invisible agents may stem from evolved survival mechanisms, like detecting predators or social partners. Does that make religion more of a cognitive byproduct than an adaptation?
If by religion we mean the belief in one or more superhuman beings and all of the rituals and practices that go around that, all of that big cultural complex of stuff, I find extremely unlikely to be an adaptation, right? Because that's not usually the way that adaptations work. adaptations are usually much more narrow focused kind of things. This is a whole lot of things that sort of seem to traffic together oftentimes, but seem to have different kind of causal pathways. So I'm not attracted to the adaptationist position for at least that kind of reasoning. But if you wanted to be more specific and say, well, what about just belief in a God of some sort? Is that an adaptation? Well, even there, I usually find myself in what's called the byproduct camp as far as this goes.
Yeah.
But I want to explain that because lots of people, they hear that and they go, a byproduct. Religion's a byproduct of the way our minds, develop or evolve, or whatever language you want to say. That's something bad. Byproducts are bad. Like, well, no, gasoline is actually a byproduct of refining, oil in other kinds of ways, or there are all kinds of really good byproducts that then we discover their utility and the value in them. And in this case, I'm of the view, my view may change on this, but I think the evidence supports the view that our belief in a God, for instance, is a byproduct of a number of different kinds of cognitive dispositions. One of those is this teleofunctional reasoning or teleological reasoning, seeing, design, and purpose. One of them is the tendency to explain, especially events that look purposeful in terms of someone did it, someone brought it about, so intentional reasoning. Of our tendency to detect agency, that is, intentional beings that do stuff very easily and reason in terms of agents. And we can add on more and more. So there are a handful of these sort of ingredients that seem to be there that all sort of nudge us in the direction of a belief in at least one God or one supernatural being.
Yeah.
But not any one of those does the job all by itself. If you follow me.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, this doesn't seem to fit the profile of an adaptation, at least not in the normal sense of a cognitive adaptation or a psychological adaptation.
Yeah.
Is that clear enough? Or
it is. It is. And I actually wanted to ask a more nuanced follow-up question because
sure, yeah, please.
I try and, follow as much as possible your position, but I may make a straw man of your position. So from my understanding from your book and also your subsequent interviews on this topic, you're not saying that the belief in God is right or wrong due to your research. You're simply saying it could be consistent with either. So your work has been used to argue for the existence of God, but from my understanding, you don't think that's an argument for God. You believe this is something which is independent, and evolution from your perspective is something which is metaphysically neutral. That's the understanding I got when I was trying to follow your work.
That's right. I do think that evolution is metaphysically, well, do I? I actually think that evolution is more consistent with theism than non-theism. But
interesting. Okay, that's really that's quite interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, so I think that's the case. I think it's slight, it's subtle, but I do. I'm with Alvin Plantinga on this. I actually think that it's harder to reconcile evolution theism. So in that sense, I think it tilts a little bit towards theism. But that wasn't really the heart of your question.
Well, it made me very happy because I haven't heard you say this before. So I was like, yes, I got a nugget out of Dr. Barrett. No one has this yet.
Let's see. But the first part of it was, do I think that the evidence for...
I reword it in a more concise way. It was a bit of a mouthful. What I'm saying is that from my understanding, your research doesn't say that theism or atheism is more correct. It could be consistent with either perspective.
Yeah, that's right. I think that to take that next step, you have to bring a certain kind of philosophical framework to get you there. That on its face that there is a naturalistic sort of account that we can sort of, or scientific account, I shouldn't say naturalistic in this context, that'll confuse things, but a scientific account that there are mechanisms that we can point to that bring about, that tend to bring about religious beliefs in a population. Well, it's not remotely clear to me why that would tilt one way or the other. Because even if this is God's world and God designed it, well, surely God would design it with mechanisms that do this kind of work. And if there is no God and people do still have this tendency to arrive at these sorts of beliefs, there surely are mechanisms that would incline them toward these kinds of beliefs or bring them there. So, yeah, I don't see that it plays a big role. I find it a little bit analogous to the idea of, let's say, religious experiences. Okay, so religious experiences may or may not be experiences that we deem religious may or may not be tracking some real being out there who is communicating with us through the experience. But sort of, for instance, trying to study which brain area is active during the religious experience isn't going to tell us a whole lot about whether we should regard those experiences as veridical or valuable or truth tracking, because I think at this point we all assume that it's something is going on in this part of the brain, and so if we narrow it down to this part of the brain, it's not clear to me why that debunks or supports anything. We knew the brain was active, we can put it that way. We're just learning how it's active. We already knew that there would be, if we're of the right ilk, if we're cognitive scientists, we already know that our minds are doing work to form representations of God. What we didn't know is, well, what work are they doing, and what's that developmental course, and where does it come from? So yes, I tend to be on the no. I think this evidence is neutral unless you bring in some other kind of philosophical sorts of considerations.
Okay.
But that's, yeah, go ahead. I see you have a follow-up.
Just on that, because before we move on, I just wanted your thoughts on something. I had Michael Roos on this channel a few months ago, and he said something interesting, and I wanted your perspective on this. Now, obviously, he's an atheist, but he said something really interesting. He says that he resonates with Cardinal Henry Newman's, the famous theologian and poet's idea that I don't believe in God because of design. I believe in God, therefore I believe in design. Is that the sort of idea that you're getting at? Is that you need some metaphysical framework or some sort of scaffolding before you can come to a judgment using the research?
Yeah.
Okay, so an easier way could be that the world would seem designed to someone depending upon not the data itself, but metaphysical beliefs they hold prior to seeing the data.
I'm not sure about that. When we're talking about design in particular, my impression is that we're going to see that impression of design actually is pre-reflective. It's before we've got some kind of metaphysical thing going on there, or any reflective reasons to think one way or another about it. But what I'm getting at is, but what you do with that impression of design, whether you judge it to be an error or truth tracking, right? Like that's veridical. No, there really is design, or there isn't design. Whichever of those you choose has something to do with then your maybe your foundational kinds of beliefs to begin with anyway, or your metaphysics. So it's slightly different than I think what I was hearing.
I get your point. Could I introduce definitions of design to make this situation?
Please, yeah.
Because One of the ways that some philosophers would break this down is they would say design as in a functional organization, something that could be due to self-organization or natural selection. That's different to a Platonic external designer. So when you're referring to design, you're kind of just referring to the idea that children intuitively see functionality in the world, organization in the world, as opposed to a Platonic external designer.
You're right that was what I chiefly had in mind, but I want to observe that since writing Born Believers, though, post-Born Believers, there has been some additional research by Alyssa Yarnefelt and Deb Kellerman suggesting one step further that this design, what's Dan Dennett called the design stance, when viewing the natural world, actually triggers the intentional stance almost automatically. At least they've got some. So they really are getting all the way to not just teleological thinking, but intentional kind of thinking. Because it's the only game in town in some ways for the young kid. If a 4-year-old looks at the world and they see design, they assume someone did it. And that's why I go ahead and use that word, that idea of design there. But go ahead, keep being a philosopher with me and clarify me, push me, because I want to be precise with this. I don't want to make claims that are just sort of silly because we've misunderstood each other.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I think let's have a little bit more discussion on just the idea of teleology in biology, because it is something which classical Darwinism was supposed to get rid of, right? Now, there's a whole bunch of historians who'd basically argue, well, Darwin reinvented teleology. he didn't do away with it. But anyway, let's break it down in some very simple terms. We have the likes of J.B.S. Haldane, the famous neo-Darwinist from the 20th century, saying, teleology is a mistress to the biologist. He can't live without her, but he doesn't want to be seen with her in public. We have this very this worry that somehow by referring to teleology, we're going to bring back creationism or something like this, which obviously they don't want to do that. At the same time, it's been impossible to speak of biological systems without referring to agency, purpose, purpose or some sort of functionality. And again, it comes back to this point again and again. So currently, what's basically going on is there's a lot of discussion about illusion of design and a reality of design in the context of naturalism. So you have the likes of people like Massimo Piglucci, who would say design is simply an illusion of design, right? Actually, it's better to use Dawkins because he's much more lucid on this point. And then you'd have people like Scott Turner, who is working within naturalism, but he would say design is real, but it's actually made by the organism itself, so not an external Platonic creator. From my understanding, your view and your research and everything that you're working on since you published, it doesn't swing left or right. It's something which seems to just argue that we have this disposition, where it came from, what's the origin. You don't delve into that too much.
That's true. I don't. Where you'll sometimes see me get a little more philosophical is in terms of what are the implications for whether or not these things are not necessarily true, but whether your beliefs that result from these tendencies have, we might say, positive epistemic status, to sort of dance past all kinds of thorny philosophical issues. That is, they're the kind of thing you ought to believe. You've got good reasons or grounds to believe, at least prima facie, until you have evidence to the contrary. I am of the view that if we've got good reason to think that our minds are working. Well, sorry, I'll put it this way. If we don't have reasons to think that our minds aren't working well, that we haven't been deceived, that we haven't been misled, that these beliefs are arising by human minds doing what human minds do in normal environments in which human minds do them, then those who hold those beliefs are perfectly entitled to those beliefs. They sort of get an initial kind of prima facie kind of positive epistemic status. That doesn't mean they can't be defeated, but I am a sort of a common sense realist in that regard. And so then finding evidence that this is the way that ordinary human minds work ordinarily in ordinary human environments does at least set up somebody who has that kind of epistemological system, which I do, to say, okay, and so the beliefs that result from the way that our minds work, at least initially, have positive epistemic status. And that this evidence then supports those beliefs, at least initially. That doesn't mean they won't be defeated. So then that starts sounding, some of my opponents say, well, then you're not entirely neutral. And I'm like, well, no, I think the evidence is neutral unless you happen to be a common sense realist or maybe some kind of a pragmatist or some other kind. You have to bring that philosophy into it. And then suddenly it's like, now it's actually favors religious beliefs generally. But that doesn't mean there aren't some other thorny problems lurking around. It would just be very peculiar to me if we'd say, well, human minds naturally sort of gravitate towards certain kinds of beliefs. They're almost intuitive, so they're wrong. What? Wait, what? That's not how we usually talk about these things.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting perspective. So this leads me to a follow-up question. Your research has been used in debates and discussions about.
Oh, sorry, what just happened?
Yeah, that was a zoom. I think you zoomed in somehow.
It's the large smart camera. Sorry.
All right, so you got to do some movements with your hand. I think you need to go the other way.
I apologize.
That's fine. I don't really have an issue with that.
I don't know if I can get it to stop.
Okay, that's fine. Oh, there you go. Something happened.
Oh, okay. Now can I turn off the? Okay, I think I turned. Sorry about that. Very dramatic.
That's a plus. Okay. Your research has been used in popular discussions. I mean, the most popular discussion I know of that's been used in is a discussion between Jordan Peterson and Muhammad Hijab. So in this discussion, Hijab was basically arguing for the existence of God and using many different evidences. And one of the things that he pointed out is the Islamic concept of the fitrah, which is known as the innate disposition. And he used your research. Now, obviously, he's coming to your research with the metaphysical framework. So he's reading your work from that perspective. What if you were sitting, in between the two of them and they're having this discussion? What would your input be the way that you saw your research being referenced there? Would you say, well, guys, there's a bit more nuance to this. Maybe it could go this way or that way? Because I kind of felt like Peterson wasn't really aware of it. And I think he was going to, Hijab was trying to get him to look into it. I'm sure you've seen the clip. It's a very popular clip.
Yeah, I have seen that. What would I say? I would say there's something suggestive here. From my, limited understanding of Fitra, there's something that sort of resonates with that concept. In Christianity, it's sensus divinitatis is the most popular version of the sense of the divine, it's sometimes called. And there's overlap between these two concepts, right? That we have a natural inclination toward theism. The reason I'd say there's something suggestive there, and I'd also say, but it's a little too soon to get too excited. And that's because a lot of the divine attributes that usually are associated with fitra are understudied at this point. That doesn't mean there's evidence contrary to them. I'm saying that the evidence hasn't been gathered yet. I mean, interesting that you bring this up. I will be doing a lecture, I think, next week as part of a conference called Theism, East and West, I think, that's hosted by a university in Iran. And I'll be talking about this. So you're helping me get prepared. And but one of the things that I want to do in that presentation is actually sort of basically offer an invitation to a research program that philosophers, theologians, and the right kinds of cognitive and psychological scientists could all contribute to, because there's a lot of missing information. For instance, we have reason to think from Deb Kellerman and her students and colleagues and collaborators' work to that, from early childhood, we see design and purpose in the natural world, and associate that with someone being behind it. Her work, Oliver Petrovich at Oxford, Susan Gelman at University of Michigan, lots of people have contributed to that literature. What they have not done, as far as I can tell, is ask children whether, like Piaget thought or reported that some children suggested, was that there's a whole team of creators. For instance, they usually just ask, did someone do it? And the children will say, yeah, I picked someone over it just happened every time. Overwhelmingly, the 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds will pick someone did this stuff as opposed to it just happened or whatever else. They know that someone is not humans. Okay, so Piaget seemed to have that one wrong. But what isn't clear, for instance, the Fitra suggests a unity, right? No, there's one God that did this stuff, not lots of gods. And that hasn't been asked about, as far as I can tell, of where children's intuitions are. I think so far to date, the evidence is consistent with the idea that there's one, and that would be the simplest answer. But we haven't really looked at that very carefully. We haven't looked at goodness of God very much. We haven't looked at whether God is a moral exemplar, or that having a belief about God really does lead to the sort of moral attributes that also is usually considered part of Fitra. So, so it's intriguing because there's enough evidence, I think, to encourage this kind of exploration. But my hope is that by doing that kind of exploration, we'll get more evidence and we'll be able to fine tune some of the concepts there, because it seems to me that, at least in the Christian literature, which I know a little bit better, but from my reading in the Islamic literature as well, for the very little I have, there seem to be some disagreements about some of the particulars, like, well, just how specific is the deliverances of this cognitive faculty? Is it so in Christianity we'd say, is it a sensus divinitatis, sense of the divine, or sensus Dei, sense of God, which is even more specific? Well, the thinkers in our tradition would say sensus divinitatis, probably more general. That still needs to be worked out through special revelation, through prophecy, through religious experiences. It needs to be sharpened up. But one could say, well, no, it's actually very specific. It carries the idea that there's an all-powerful creator God who is super knowing, super perceiving, morally good, immortal, and so forth. Well, let's investigate that. Let's find out how specific it is. We could also investigate whether this is a faculty, if we think of it as a cognitive faculty or disposition. Is it one that has a developmental course to it? That doesn't mean, or does it come in all at once? Or is there some development that happens? Very predictable development, just like growing teeth in our mouths. We usually think of our teeth as an innate or natural trait, but we don't have our teeth at birth. There's a developmental course. We first get the baby teeth. They come in a sort of predictable order. They fall out in a predictable age. So you've got these weird little kids at about 7, 8 years old, look like jack-o'-lanterns or something because they're missing teeth. And then eventually we get all of our adult teeth. Well, there's a developmental course there, just like there is for language learning, right? We clearly have a natural language learning faculty, but there's also a developmental course to learning language. So I know some people would be very uncomfortable with that idea, but is Fitra like that? That there's a developmental course, but that doesn't mean it isn't deeply sort of intrinsic or to who we are as humans, part of our nature. And so there are those questions that are still, I think, open questions.
Yeah.
If,
And there's some really, I guess, some side missions we could do with some research, in terms of if that is the case, then just like with language, if you don't have that input from the environment, you can have a child with the innate ability, but they're mute. They were raised by wolves in a forest or whatever. There's some really interesting things there. I wanted to ask you a related question about the strength of this disposition towards believing in purpose and teleology. So one of the things that you argue is that religious ideas persist because they are minimally counterintuitive. I want to ask a question which I think people would have if they read this, which is, well, why is it then that in the West and in a lot of the industrial world, we find a decline in religion if it's so minimally counterintuitive? We would expect it to persist despite the pressure of modernity.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you always ask the hard questions. Let's see. It seems to me there are probably at least two parts to this. One of those concerns just the what do we mean by minimally counterintuitive, and what's that got to do with it? And the other is the sort of secularization. And they are related. The first bit, while it is the case that, and I think we've got some experimental evidence that suggests that when ideas are so-called minimally counterintuitive, that is, they're largely intuitive, but they've got just little conceptual tweaks attached to them, just little ones that make them attention demanding, interesting. They're worth paying attention to, they're worth talking about. That gives them a boost when it comes to transmission in a population. Okay, so we've got some experimental evidence that seems to be the case. That's not the only that's not the only factor that matters here, though. It also matters that the counterintuitiveness in question creates lots of inferential potential, is the jargon. So that helps them generate explanations, predictions, make meaning, make sense out of our experiences and the way we view the world otherwise. And so sometimes I'll give these sorts of illustrations, like we could talk about, I don't know, there's an invisible rock in my room right now in my office. And, it's about the size of a brick, but it's invisible. Well, that's minimally counterintuitive. You can generate lots of inferences about the properties of this brick. And it's kind of interesting that I have such a thing would, certainly get our attention. It's easy to think about and talk about, but it's not going to do things.
It's back again.
It's back again. Darn thing. But that, pay attention to this. But it's not going to, the idea of an invisible brick is not going to account for why there is a natural world around me that seems to have all of these sort of good properties that works really well. It doesn't help me answer those teleological kinds of perceptions. It doesn't ground my morality. It doesn't tell me what I should do with my life the next day. It's very limited kind of concept. So because of lack of inferential potential. So what we need are minimally counterintuitive ideas that also have lots of inferential potential. Well, those tend to be often about the right kinds of intentional beings, like gods. Those are the ones that manage to spread really well. Because they're minimally counterintuitive, yes. Because they have lots of inferential potential, yes. Because our minds are drawn to thinking about intentional beings, yes. All of these sorts of things come together. Okay, that's sort of the big story. But then why does belief in such things seem to be fading in lots of the West? I'll offer, well, we'll see how many explanations I have for you. Instead of trying to count them in advance. At least three, I think. One is that it's not remotely clear, actually, that belief in supernatural beings is diminishing. So I will push back on that assumption. It is the case that institutionalized religion seems to be fading, but Westerners are deinstitutionalizing entirely, right? So in the United States, where I live, it's not just that people are no longer saying that they're part of churches, for instance. They're also saying they're no longer part of political parties. They're disaffiliating in lots of ways. So I think there's something going on there. In the UK, sort of famously, there was some research suggesting that as over the last several decades, as the rate of people saying they believe in God has gone down and church attendance has gone down, belief in ghosts and spirits has gone up. Mm-hmm. So it's not that they're not believing in supernatural beings, they're believing in different supernatural beings. That's part of the story. There may be an overall decrease. So those are sort of two factors. Third factor, it may be that they really are, that what we're seeing is a lot of effort and cultural scaffolding in supporting non-agentive accounts of the design and purpose that we see. Certainly Darwinism is doing some of that work. But we also have a tendency to personify and otherwise make meaning of non-agentive systems and give them agency. That's a common kind of educational move. We'll talk about market forces, for instance, in economic circles, right? The invisible hand, and we'll even give it human parts, things like that, of capitalism or whatever system you want. And those are ways this is just as those are ways of discouraging this sort of agentive traditional kind of thinking, that this is God's design, or that the spirits are doing this, or whatever it is. So I think there are a handful of different factors sort of in the water that are sort of all moving in the direction of a rejection of traditional kinds of theistic belief for the time being. But even still, right, globally, the rate of theism is still somewhere probably over 80%, which is maybe the highest it's ever been. Right, there are these weird kinds of anomalies out there, right? That theism is growing in China as maybe faster than ever, for instance, and it's the most secular country, or most atheistic country is the right way to put it, I think, at least according to sociological surveys. But that may be changing.
Yeah. So to go back to your first point, I would agree with you that it's more of an institutional sort of shift away from that institutional sort of religion, and superstitions and belief in something supernatural is just as strong. I totally agree with that, because you will find that everywhere, or all across the Western cities, you will find people who believe in something beyond nature. The other thing I wanted to get your thoughts on is, when you argue that this innate belief is minimally counterintuitive, that doesn't mean that if there's an active suppression of that it's going to resist that. It could be suppressed, but when that active suppression through indoctrination or cultural pressures is removed, then you can see it flourishing. And for me, the biggest evidence of what you're arguing for is actually the Soviet Union, because we had decades of repression of religion, the destruction of monasteries, temples, synagogues, mosques, everything. You had a replacement with something that could be argued in some way was religious, right?
Yeah,
So
that's right.
but then with the collapse of the Soviet Union, you get this resurgence in religion. And I remember, I mean, I obviously can point towards the numbers, and everybody knows how religious Russia and the former Soviet Central Asian republics, which are Muslim, are compared to what they were in the past. But even speaking to people one-to-one from that era who went through the communist era, who went through scientism, Darwinism, materialism, humanism, liberalism, it only took a few more years of being out of that, and they just swang back, and sometimes in a stronger way. So for me, I mean, that's the response I would give if I was in your position. I would say, well,
oh, you're right. That's much better. Why didn't you just answer the question? That's
but for me, that's the biggest sociological experiment, right? It's something no one paid for, but it's there in front of our eyes.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's right. And then
Yeah.
China is another case study where there's an active
Nice.
suppression as well there. And you raised some other factors that I didn't mention. I mean, one of those is that there's this in much of, it was, certainly in the Soviet Union and in China as well, but in any of parts of the world in which some strong Marxist ideologies have taken over, there's been this sort of triumvirate of, well, to be scientific and to be Marxist and to be atheist all travel together.
Yeah.
And that's become this sort of dogma. And so if somebody's attracted to one of those three things, they think they need the other two at the same time. So,
no, this is actually a really interesting point, because I followed closely the rise of new atheism in the early 2000s onwards. And one of the things I noticed is they had no new arguments which weren't being used by communists and others before them. But because they came with a package of human rights and feminism and liberalism and LBGT and all these woke sort of pre-woke ideology, people were attracted to the package.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, I don't want to be Christian, I don't want to be Muslim, I don't want to be Jewish, I don't want to be any of these things. Okay, so I will accept this wholesale package. But you could argue that, in many ways, new atheism led people back to some form of, conservative, minimalistic belief. You find this all across the West. I mean, I'm sure it's true in your across the pond from me, but here in Europe, we're seeing a rise of religion again. It's very visible.
it's interesting. Yeah, it's and these sort of historical wrinkles. It'll be fascinating to see how they play out. The death of religion, right, has been forecasted, of religions. We should really just say theisms, because that's really what people meant, has been forecasted for, 150 years, and it's never really happened. So we'll see. Stay tuned, right?
Absolutely. We got through a lot of questions. I actually have one last question for you, which is, I believe, the most important. If you were not restricted by funding restraints or restraints in terms of other limitations which are put on people when they have to apply for research, what experiment would you do to further the case that you already outlined in your book? Say you had $1 billion to do this experiment.
Yeah. That's a really great question. Wish I had spent more time thinking about that. I'm tempted to say that I like to build teams around things like this. So what I would do is build a big team, a team of, as I gestured to earlier, theologians, philosophers, and cognitive and psychological scientists of the right sort, coming from lots of different worldview perspectives, to generate a whole bunch of ideas about say, starting with some of these more theological reflections on ideas like fitra or sensus divinitatis. Well, what are the different permutations out there that seem to be plausible? Okay, how do we measure those? What do we take as evidence of those? And we'll do a global kind of study of their development and distribution, and ideally a longitudinal one. So one of the things that's really hard to do in most of these scientific areas, particularly because of the restrictions on grant making, grant has to, last a certain window of time. And really we should want to track children from lots of different, in lots of different family backgrounds, being raised in lots of different ways in lots of different places over the first, 7 years of their lives. And carefully track, what are they being exposed to, and have little sort of dip-ins to see how are things going? How is their cognition developing with regard to scene design and purpose, their understanding of intentional agents and the minds of different beings? And how is that changing over time in relation then to their religious beliefs, or they're being discouraged from religious beliefs, whatever it is in their particular situation, so that we can get a much more granular picture of all of this. I think that'd be fascinating. And the nice thing with kids is we really, probably because you get much younger than 2 years old and stuff gets messy, we could narrow that window to 2 to 7 years old, and then have kind of a 5-year window. And we just track kids all around the world for 5 years. And we would learn a lot about all of this stuff. So, okay, there's my stab at if I had $1 billion, how would I forward this?
That would definitely be interesting. So I interviewed you previously on your book, How Your Faith Can Fuel Scientific Discovery. So for anyone who's interested, please do have a watch of that interview. It's on the same playlist. So any last words from you in terms of any research or books that you're working on that people can look forward to?
Maybe not yet. I think when we talked last time, when we were talking about how can your faith fuel scientific discovery, I mentioned that I have hopes of making a slightly more weightier version of that. I've drafted about 2/3 of that, but haven't yet found time and resources to get that thing finished. But I'd like to do that. It would be more interfaith, sort of worldview general as well. So I'd like to do that because I think that regardless of what kind of worldview we have, we should be much more reflective about how it informs, motivates, and inflects the way that we do the sciences, and how it leads to certain kinds of interpretations. That'd just be something for all of us who work in the sciences to be aware of, and for the general public to be aware of, because too many people are pretending that the sciences are value neutral and what they generate are somehow neutral, and that is not the case. So
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if you are to write something on that, it would be really nice to hear your perspective on the laws of nature and whether you think they're ontologically prescriptive or epistemically descriptive, because a lot of these things are not really clarified for the public. And so in many ways, you get the hard materialists and atheists dictating what science is leading towards, when there's actually there's actually a very nuanced discourse. And I'm all in favor for hearing the other side, but in a fair way, all options are laid out rather than just one option.
So is that a book you're working on?
No, it's not. It's actually part of my
research. Should it be?
It's part of my research in terms of my postgraduate studies. So I interviewed Peter Harrison. I'll send you the interview. His work on the supernatural has been really fascinating. But I do believe there's a need for theists to work together to actually give a coherent narrative to counteract the other strong narrative that's used by hard materialists, because it does have an impact. Because science is such a powerful cultural force that whoever seems to be justifying it or at the forefront of it, people flock towards them.
Yeah, that's right.
I don't think it's I don't think we're fairly represented in this.
You are quite right. No, I agree with you. Well, good for you. Great topic. I think you're right.
Absolutely, and
Wonderful.
it'd be great to have you back sometime.
All right.
It's always a pleasure having you
We'll
on board.
stay in touch. Yeah. Thanks for reaching out.
It's been my pleasure. You have a safe night.
All right. You too.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.